the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee.
So, dear friends, we shall continue with the reflections on the first two chapters of the first book of Kings. We have already seen the important events in chapters 1 and 2. In chapter 1, we saw how Solomon was installed as the king of Israel, and Adoniah's effort to become the king was obstructed, and David chose Solomon and not Adoniah. And in chapter 2, we already mentioned about the final words of David, and there we find David is exhorting his son Solomon to do as he thinks fit. The retaliatory actions towards Joab, the military chief, and Shimei the Benjaminite, who cursed David, threw stones at him, and so on. And we also dealt with the problem how a holy man like David can ask at his deathbed to take revenge on the enemies. It is totally unbecoming him. But we try to explain the reasons. Justice is to be done to the victims. It is in that dimension we are to analyze and see these events. And thus we see David is entrusting the cases of Joab and Shimei to Solomon. And thus we can say there are 3 or 4 important enemies of Solomon, and living either in the palace or in nearby places. One is Adoniah. Second is Abiathar the priest, who supported Adoniah. Third is Joab. He also supported Adoniah. And not only that, he committed the sins of murders. And fourthly, the Shimei, the Benjaminite, who also lived in the vicinity, or he was also there. And now, how the death of all these persons occur? And that is yet the story that we are to complete. First of all, with Adoniah. And Adoniah once went to Bathsheba, and in an innocent way, he pretended to ask a favor from Bathsheba. And what is the favor that he wants? He wants to have the Shunammite woman, Abishag, who was the concubine of David in his uh, old, old age. And seemingly it is an innocent request. And he asked Bathsheba, kindly request to Solomon to give me or hand over to me the Shunammite woman, Abishag. And Bathsheba, not knowing the hidden intentions of Adoniah, goes to the King Solomon, the new king, and puts forward the request made by Adoniah. Once she finished talking, immediately the reply of Solomon came. And that is something which Bathsheba even did not expect. And what does he say? Why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adoniah? Ask for him the kingdom as well, for he is my elder brother. Ask not only for him, but also for the priest Abiathar and for Joab, son of Zeruiah. In verse 22 of chapter 2. Okay, now, what is the meaning of this question? The reason we can understand in this way. There was a practice, and commonly kept in those times, about the kings. If a king happens to die without sons or daughters and so on, then the one who marries even the wife or the widow of the deceased king has a right to the throne. And here we say, if Adoniah marries Abishag, the concubine of David, naturally he has a right to the throne. And that is why Solomon got angry with his mother. Do you not understand these things? Why do you ask such favors for him? And being irritated, he goes still further. Why don't you ask for Joab and Abiathar, the priest, and so on? And in this expression we say, Solomon is actually pointing his finger to Joab, Abiathar, Adoniah, and so on, because they are one group now, one faction. They all have gone against the will of David and hence had committed the crime of treason. And therefore now he says, okay, why don't you ask favors for Joab and Abiathar, the priest? And when he was angry, he expressed these things. And then his resolve, it is high time to do away with Adoniah. Otherwise, he will make trouble for him. And that's the story we find now. And he decides to kill Adoniah because he overstepped the boundary Solomon had kept for him. And remember what he said earlier: if you live in the proper manner, you'll be safe. But if you cross the border, then things will be difficult. And this is what happens here. He crossed the border set for him. And that is the thought of Solomon. And he is asking his servants to kill Adoniah, and they kill him. And thus Adoniah is finished. Okay, even though it is under the pretext of doing or fulfilling the command given by David, fulfilling the will of God, or we can say he was doing away with the possible threat from Adoniah. That is what he did. And he found out a reason for the same. That is all. Okay. And now there is the next person, Joab, and also Abiathar. When Joab and Abiathar heard that Solomon had executed Adoniah, they become afraid. And they were in a big dilemma what to do. And now Solomon calls Abiathar the priest and says, okay, you go to your family people in Anathoth, the family of Nob the high priest. You go there, because it was from there Abiathar escaped, because we have already seen the story. Saul killed Nob and all the priests of the family of Nob, but Abiathar alone escaped. And hence we find now Solomon asks Abiathar to return to his own place. That means he is not welcome in the kingdom of Solomon. He can go to his own place, his own family. And thus Abiathar is banished. And now there is Joab. When Joab heard of what happened to Adoniah and then to Abiathar, he becomes really worried. And he knew the next is his turn. And therefore, being afraid, he ran away and entered the temple or the tent of the presence of the Lord, and caught hold of the horns of the altar. We know the custom is somebody holds on to the horn of the altar, they cannot be killed. And therefore, he went into the tent of the presence of the Lord and held on to the horn of the altar. And he was sure that nothing will happen to him as long as he is there. And the news was conveyed to Solomon. And of course, from the early talk with his mother, Bathsheba, we get the impression that Solomon is really angry with all these three: Adoniah, Abiathar, and Joab, because they were one group. And hence, he wanted to take revenge on them, in a way, we can say. And this Joab knew very well. And that's why he took refuge in the tent. And when the news was conveyed to Solomon, he asked, okay, let him come out of the tent. But Joab said, I will not come out. If you want to kill me, you can kill me here, but I will not come out. The news was again conveyed to Solomon, and then Solomon said, okay, do according to what he said. And Solomon's servants killed Joab too. And thus we find Joab is executed, so also Adoniah, Abiathar is banished. And then there is one more person whose story was practically destined by the words of David. It is Shimei, nobody else. And Shimei became afraid. And Solomon called him and said to him, okay, you can live in Jerusalem. Why he says this, the reason is not given, but we can infer. Shimei is to live under the eye of Solomon, or the eyes of Solomon. Then only he can have an effective control over him. He should not go out of Jerusalem. And hence Solomon said to Shimei, you can live in this house in Jerusalem, but should not go out of Jerusalem. If ever you go beyond the Wadi Kidron, or the small rivulet Kidron, you will be killed or you will be terminated. And Shimei said, it is a fair judgment, I agree. And he was living there. And after almost 3 years had elapsed, something happened in the house of Shimei. 2 of his servants, they escaped from the house of Shimei, and they went to the king Achish of Gath. And Achish was a Philistine king, or the king of one of the Philistine kingdoms. And naturally, they might have escaped. Okay, we can think in this way by looting something from the house of Shimei or something like that. Okay, whatever it be, they escaped and went to Achish. And Shimei comes to know about, Shimei comes to know about it, and he went in search of his servants to Gath, the kingdom of Achish, because it was informed him that they are there. And he went there and brought them back. And the news was conveyed to Solomon. And Solomon asked him, why did you disobey my command? Why did you go out of Jerusalem? And then Solomon said, you have opted for your own future or your own death. I had warned you, but you did not take care. And hence, you are going to pay for what you did. And I know what all evil things you did to my father David. And hence, you are not fit to live, you are to die. And he asked his servants to kill Shimei, and he was killed. Thus, we find the enemies of Solomon and David are killed one by one. Of course, when we look at this scenario, on one side we get a picture. David is doing away with all his enemies and thus securing the kingdom in his hands. And that is why we find in the last verse of chapter 2, there we read, "Thus the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon." Okay, this is the way how the kingdom was established. And there is still another version of all these stories. According to some authors, there are two traditions that are intermingled in chapters 1 and 2. One a positive tradition and other a negative tradition. Okay, the positive tradition is that Solomon did everything well, but all the blame is put on David. He is the one who asked to settle accounts with Joab, Shimei, and so on. Thus, Solomon is freed. But actually, we can see Solomon is executing his enemies, and David's words became a reason for that, or one of the reasons. In that way, we can see. And therefore, whether we are to hold on to the positive presentation of Solomon or negative presentation of Solomon, we are not sure. But whatever it be, Solomon got rid of all his enemies. The kingdom of Israel is secured in his hands now, and no more enemy to be afraid of. And all these were powerful ones: Adoniah, Joab, Shimei the Benjaminite. He could organize a revolt against Solomon, and now all are finished, and no more enemies in front. And hence, it is easy to say the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon. And that is a conclusion of the story of succession narrative. Earlier we had mentioned the particular section called succession narrative tries to give an answer to the question, who will sit on the throne of David? And now it is made clear. David's own son, Solomon, will rule as his successor. The issue is settled forever. And in the instruction given by David to Solomon is also mentioned that if Solomon continues to live as best as he can, obeying the commandments of God and doing everything possible to follow the ways, the ordinances, the commands of Yahweh, then his kingdom will last forever, and his descendants will rule over Israel. And that is what he reminds Solomon. And therefore, now things are clear for us. There was some difficulty to understand the events narrated in chapters 1 and 2. But we can say everything comes to an end peacefully. The questions, we can even ask further questions. Whether the words of Nathan was mere a deceitful story, and whether David was really a person who could understand nothing. He was unable to exercise his reason. Of course, from the words that are attributed to him, we can say that he would not seem to be a person who is unable to exercise his reasoning power. He was reasonable and he exercised his reason, and hence we cannot just say it is merely a fabricated story, but more than that, it is something that took place according to the will of David himself. Thus, we can say David is there now with the with his last words. And therefore, this is, as we said, the conclusion of the succession narrative. And these stories practically bring to our mind the accession to the throne of David by Solomon was not a peaceful one. It was shedding blood. Of course, whether it was needed for the sake of the nation or not, we do not know. But as we mentioned earlier, justice was to be given to the victims, and Solomon became an instrument to give justice to the victims like Abner, Amasa, and Absalom. And in the case of Shimei, the victim is David himself. And therefore we can say justice is being served to the victims. And hence the initial bloodshed was not to be a big problem, we can say. Okay, thus a big era, the era of Solomon, of David, comes to an end. And now a new era begins, and that is the story of King Solomon. Of course, when we think of the history of Israel, we can say David is the great king. We have already seen that when David had built up his own city of Jerusalem, brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and made it the city of God, and then he also got the divine promise of Davidic dynasty. Thereafter, David began growing in power and he became rich. All the neighboring kingdoms were conquered by him one by one. And we will see he had conquered many of the vassal kingdoms of either Assyria or Syria and so on. Thus everything is under his control. And therefore David became a mighty king. Even if we cannot call him a great emperor, he was the emperor of a small kingdom. And he established his kingdom very well. And he accumulated wealth. And Solomon just acquired or received all things, all this. He got all this from King David. And there is sometimes a question raised, who is the most glorious one, either David or King Solomon? Of course, we can say, politically, David was the mighty king, because Solomon did not go for fighting with enemies. It is true that he had authority over all the nations till the great rivers of the east, Euphrates and Tigris. It is mentioned in the story. But at the same time, we know he was not the person who conquered all this, just David. And therefore, we can say David is the real hero, political hero. He is the glorious king. And again, David is the one who is the beloved of Yahweh. Always in the story, David is called my beloved son, David, by Yahweh. And therefore, this dimension is never seen with regard to Solomon. Yahweh cautioned Solomon, saying, if you obey my commandments, you also will be like my servant David. But he did not obey. And therefore, even the realm of the divine, in his relation to God, we can say David was the one who was favored by the Lord. And that is why this phrase is always used for him, my beloved son David, or my beloved servant David. And therefore, now it is clear for us. David is the mighty king. And David is the most glorious king of Israel. Solomon was indeed mighty, glorious, but only after David. And he got all this only from the hands of David, because David accumulated the wealth, David defeated the enemies, and David established the neutral capital, and David brought the Ark of the Covenant, and thus we find all the settings were done by David, and Solomon just inherited all that was done by David. And hence we can say David is the real hero of the story, and Solomon is just a benefactor of all these great achievements which David had for himself. And therefore, with this reflection, we can conclude our reflections on the first two chapters and also the conclusion of this so-called succession narrative. And as we read in the last verse, we also can be sure of this fact. Thus, the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon. Okay, hereby we stop, and in the next session, we will begin with the reflection on King Solomon. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord, for the gift and love of your sacred word. Open our hearts to put into practice that which you have revealed to us through your word. Amen.